IVM.
The COVID-19 pandemic has meant that most of us have stayed home this year and limited our excursions to the outside world as much as possible. But there is an upside. These restrictions have led to an unprecedented fall in greenhouse gas emissions in the first half of 2020. This is larger than during the 2008 financial crisis and even World War II. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan, and every fortnight I speak to a guest about global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to the largest emissions drop in modern history. But this isn't really a viable environment policy. International climate negotiations have been fraught with buck passing and power politics. So how can we think about climate change negotiations over the last couple of years? How has India's climate policy taken shape? And how does the Indian government essentially think about climate policy? My guest for today has some answers. Shikha Basin is a researcher on climate change mitigation policies at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, or CEEW. She leads CEEW's research on cooling and phasing down of hydrofluorocarbons. She's a co-author of the India Cooling Action Plan, or the ICAP, and she continues to serve as a member of the implementation committees for the ICAP on research and development and the servicing sector. Shikha has worked extensively on international technology cooperation research projects on climate change in Europe and India. I'm going to talk to her about the politics of climate change, what's happening on the world stage, and how the Indian government makes climate policy. But before we get into the conversation, let's take a short break to hear from IVM Podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome, amazing, superb week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. What a week we had this week. We had so much crossover, so many great guests. I don't even know where to start. Okay, yeah, I do know where to start. Let's start with Uncle Please Sit. Uncle Please Sit, Joel and Tushar had Hamsini Hariharan. Hamsini hosts a show called States of Anarchy with their network. She is a China expert, and they discuss the India-China relationship. Really fascinating conversation. Cyrus had two conversations this week instead of our normal Thursday Cock and Bull. Great conversations, both of them. We'll be back with our regular Cock and Bull next week. But this week, you could definitely check out the conversation he had with Varun Grover. Really fascinating stuff. And Nikhil Taneja, who was the founder of Yuva and the creative director for the India Film Project Festival, which is going on this weekend. He was on the show as well. Cyrus was also on Advertising is Dead this weekend with Varun Dugirala. Cyrus and Varun discussed Cyrus's intent on randomness. Ranveer Brar guested on Gauri Devi Dayal show. This rounds on me. Another amazing conversation over there. Priyanka Khimani, one of the best IP lawyers in this country, was on Storytellers and Storysellers for a fascinating conversation. Definitely do check that out. And finally, I wanted to congratulate Sarina Poonawalla for her 100th episode. She had Ashish Vidyarthi as a guest on that. If you have not been listening to the Empowering series, please do. It's one of the great shows out there. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, Shikha. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
When we think about the last year, particularly about the COVID pandemic, and I'm thinking about the early days when you would have videos of penguins walking through aquariums or animals out on the streets, and you think of how COVID-19 has led to temporarily better climate outcomes over the last couple of months. But that's not really a good, reliable strategy to tackle climate change, right? We can't rely on the world to just go on a pause. Can you briefly tell us what's been happening over the last couple of years in the area of international climate governance?
Sure. I think what the pandemic has also sort of done is really shown so much light on how we really are in an Anthropocene, how the human species is really at the center of how our ecosystems function today. So, you mentioned nature sort of reclaiming its spaces back because everybody else was locked up at home or in other physical spaces. What we also saw was the largest ever fall in emissions, through the course of COVID-19. However, this was still really far away from what's actually needed for us to get to a world where we're managing to limit global warming, up to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, which is basically what the Paris Agreement is striving to do with all countries on board. So the Paris Agreement came into existence in 2015. There were over 165 countries that submitted, their nationally determined contributions, which were essentially voluntary actions and ambitions that, each of them have committed to in an effort of meeting this global warming limit of up to 2 degrees or up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, while the Paris Agreement does enshrine that as the overarching goal, even if all ambitions within the NDCs are met, we're still a really far cry from that limit. Recent estimates suggest that even if all countries are to meet these commitments that they've put out, the world is on track, for a 2.7 to a well over 3 degree, limit of global warming, which is essentially a massive red alarm suggesting that actually as a community, as a global community, we're really far away from where we need to be. And the conversation needs to come back to really talk about what is it that needs to happen and what does each country need to do to make sure that we get at least on a track or a trajectory that suggests we're going to meet these ambitions that we've committed to. A second thing on the commitments itself, right, is this is a study that I did with some colleagues, namely Peter Paul, actually, who's based in Frankfurt, where we evaluated all of these NDCs. And what we found was that the amount of conditional commitments that have been put from countries, right? So everybody has said that, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're committing to. However, a space where very little conversation is happening is that out of the 168 country commitments that we evaluated, we found that more than 135 countries had actually made these commitments conditional on some kind of support, whether it is capacity building, whether it is mitigation finance, whether it is technology transfer, or it is adaptation support. And even if we take the entire 100 billion of climate finance that was sort of earmarked, by countries themselves when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, even if that entire 100 billion is earmarked towards, fulfilling NDCs, it is really far away in the tunes of millions and millions and millions of dollars for these commitments themselves to have been met. So if you think about it, you see, in the last few years, yes, countries have come together. They have highlighted this massive goal that we must reach. That goal is cognizant with what we know science has informed us about maintaining and preserving some semblance of ecosystem balances and planetary boundaries. However, beyond that big headline, the ambition that has been submitted to the UNFCCC, if I was to take that as the central pillar of the international regime on climate change, we're really far away from meeting that target that we ourselves have set out. This is also reflective of the last few years, to suggest that there is a lot of mistrust in the process itself, right? So instead of countries coming together to cooperate more, what we're seeing in the climate regime, and also I think is being reflected in how we have responded to the pandemic itself, is a very unilateral, inward-looking, national-looking response, right? And you cannot really try and solve for global commons without taking a multilateral cooperative approach. So the climate regime is, I would say, fairly reflective of the politics that we see playing out in all other spheres of the world as well.
That's very interesting because when you think about climate change negotiations and climate change obligations, it's pretty much of a no-brainer. And that's why you have a lot of climate change protests, for example, over the last couple of years that really picked up steam. Again, this seems like a very no-brainer question, but why is it that climate change is often caught up with the politics of the international system? I remember a couple of years ago, I was discussing climate change with some friends, and someone said in the early years of the COP21 summits, you would have a lot of scientists who turned up. And then essentially they were all replaced by economists and diplomats. And that reflected sort of a real change of how the climate change negotiations themselves were seen by people in different countries. What do you think?
Well, if you really sort of think about it from the point of view of what are the kind of stakeholders that are partaking in this entire regime process, right, or in this commitment making, what we find is that, of course, it's the diplomats who are going forward and negotiating, right? It has become one of the most critical issues in international relations today. Yet it has not found its core in economic thought and economic policy. Countries are still talking about climate policy. They have not yet internalized the impacts of climate when they're trying to think of their industrial policy or their economic policy. So in fact, I think that the world would do better, in fact, if there were more and more people from industry and people from academia that look at economics talking much more to the scientific community, and as a united front taking different propositions and solutions to the diplomats then to negotiate. These things are occurring in so much silos that diplomacy within the climate negotiations, of course, then gets stuck on national agendas and what people want to put out there. And there's an interesting qualifier that we have to always keep in mind when we're thinking about the international negotiations on climate change, which is that, the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol that came into being had put out some pretty clear targets for industrialized countries to begin with. The Doha Agreement, which was supposed to have been ratified years ago, is finally coming into being today. And that has created a massive void in the trust that other countries have in the process themselves, because, there's been a lot of playing around with the emissions baselines. How are you calculating for deforestation or not? What are the different carbon sinks that countries say they are trying to preserve? The way that the carbon market came and broke down completely, in the value that was being accorded to every single, certified emission reduction certificate. All of these things have led to a lot of mistrust at a diplomatic level within climate change negotiations. So while the negotiations get stalled and you don't see enough ambition and you don't see enough action being reported within that process, you are also seeing many, many, many countries doing a lot more outside of what they have committed to, to the UNFCCC and to each other as parties to the UNFCCC. So you do have mega projects and mega policies, being curated and being conceptualized and being implemented quite successfully in different parts of the world. Yet all of these are being done again in a very national, inward-looking, this is good for our country sort of way, rather than taking those solutions and amplifying them as part of their international commitments.
And, whenever I think about climate change, I always wonder about India's role within the climate change negotiations, because India was originally accused of holding up the climate change negotiations and sort of being a barrier to how a lot of the countries wanted to proceed. How do you see India's climate policy evolving over the last couple of decades?
Well, I think India has always maintained a central tenet of its, climate diplomacy has been looking at common but differentiated responsibilities, which is based on history, which is based on, responsibility that was meant to be taken by a certain group of countries, and holding that to account. And it is for that primary reason that India has been accused also of holding up negotiations, right? Because India keeps sort of going back to talking about pre-2020 commitments, which were made as part of the Kyoto Protocol agreement, that developed countries were supposed to have met. And for India, on the behalf of most developing countries, it's a very basic of trust and accountability that it all comes down to, that if we're not going to be able to have a transparent conversation about what was supposed to have happened in the pre-2020 regime as part of the UNFCCC on part of other countries, and if this entire notion is being disregarded, why should other countries come to the table and put forward commitments? More importantly, why should they believe that the commitments that are being promised for a post-2020 framework will actually be met. So, of course, while in popular media, India gets, almost lambasted for being the stickler, that's holding out, committing to what has now become the Paris Agreement, which of course India has committed to. There's a really solid reason for that. And I don't think we've done a very good job, as people working in sectors that actually do talk about this politics, in being able to communicate that effectively.
And the other thing that I often wonder about is how, after decades of negotiation, we came to the Paris Agreement, and we got a lot of countries to sign on it. But when the United States, under President Donald Trump, sort of walked out of it, it created sort of a vacuum with a lot of countries wondering about how we should go ahead. Mm-hmm. How do you think this has affected climate negotiations, and how do you see the climate change negotiations moving forward?
With all due respect to the American democracy, I mean, I think if Donald Trump was to, be brought back as president later in November this year, it is going to be a really sad day for climate negotiations globally, because I think there's no uncertainty now that, well, unless it's going to be a President Biden who comes in, US is going to be pulling out. They've already sort of set that motion in progress. Having said that, there's two ways to approach this problem, and both ways are going to have to be, internalized at every level of governance. One is that if the US is to sort of walk away, as President Donald Trump has threatened to do, how are the other countries going to organize themselves in an effort of, making sure that we still surge forward in tackling this global problem? So what does that really mean in terms of enhancing ambition in the vacuum of a US, leaving the building, so to speak? In what way are other countries going to be able to hold each other to account, given that one of the largest nations is not respecting the problem itself, much less wanting to be a part of the solution? So, for example, what it would mean is that, first of all, in that glut of leadership, right, because the Paris Agreement actually saw a lot of US leadership making it happen, in the glut of that leadership, does it mean that just about, any large country or groups of countries, for example, the European Union or China or India, it should not be that whatever it is that, these three or several other large emitters put on the table gets celebrated? There still needs to be accountability in what those commitments actually mean. Are we setting course to actually meet what we have enshrined in the Paris Agreement in terms of meeting, a particular limit of global warming? Or is it that everybody just continues to do what they think they're supposed to be doing, with very little accountability amongst each other, because the US has now left the Paris Agreement? So we need to have very, very stringent and active roles for transparency as well as accountability to get enshrined within the Paris Agreement. And that will not only come from the rule book that is being negotiated, it will also come from scientists and civil society, in actually coming up with the data and breaking down these targets. And more importantly, in mobilizing, negotiating blocks and partnerships outside of the framework of the Paris Agreement, and increasing that sense of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy amongst these large negotiators. So that's something that we'll really have to, and we should be, and, many, many actors are currently working on making that happen, but that's something that we need to look at. And that also sort of highlights the second solution, or the second, aspect that we really need to focus on, which is that, right, the politics defines largely what happens within the NDCs, these national commitments that countries put out. But what are we doing outside of it? Are we thinking about technology partnerships that look to, still over the horizon solutions? And are we trying to galvanize their research and development and demonstration? Are we, outside of the remit of the UNFCCC, being able to come up with effective enough de-risking instruments to ensure that technologies that are ready for scale up are getting financed and are getting access to capital at a rate that makes them competitive in different geographies. So it's all of these different aspects that work is happening in, which will need to keep happening outside of the UNFCCC as well.
And is all of this happening outside of the UNFCCC? How are I know that there has been sort of a spike in the number of grassroots initiatives that are coming up, as well as focusing on climate financing and the capital that's required for countries to come up with indigenous solutions to tackle their own problems. But do you see that sort of adding up on a larger scale?
I mean, it's what we're trying to work on. To put it quite bluntly, it's all happening, but it's not happening at the pace that it should be happening. And one of the major reasons for that is that level of trust has once again dissipated, right? So to bring that back into bilateral and multilateral partnerships is going to take some level of politicking and diplomacy to begin with, to really ramp it up at the level that it needs to be so that we actually, are able to meet the targets that we need to meet to be on course for limiting our climate change and global warming levels. On the other side of it, these initiatives, that are even happening within national boundaries are happening under very constrained policy and financing realities. So if we take, solar energy, for example, there's a lot of movement. The energy markets, as one of my colleagues who works on renewable energy at CW mentioned, she said, the energy markets have been very, very busy through the pandemic. And there is a lot of influx of investors, of developers who are keen to, get onto this bandwagon. But if the cost of capital for them to actually be able to invest in these projects is going to remain as high as it does, you need to look for de-risking instruments, insurance mechanisms and what have you, to actually be able to make them affordable on part of the investors. You need to start creating mechanisms that truly, bring the risk profile of such projects down. And, cost of capital is one aspect that it sort of speaks to very, very directly. So I think there's a lot of action still needed in terms of bringing the financiers together with the technology folks, and the investors themselves, and you have to then put that in a political and financial environment that makes it conducive for the three of them to be able to come together, find solutions that make sense for their projects, and really be able to deploy them at scale then.
I just want to go back to something that you'd said about sort of building trust between countries. And I think climate negotiations over the last couple of years have become more susceptible than ever to sort of the power politics in the international system. So what would building trust look like?
So within the climate negotiations, this is something that, we at CW have been working on for the last couple of years, relates a lot to the level of transparency, right? So the level of transparency that exists in reporting what's actually happening, the monitoring and review and verification, institutionalization that supports that reporting. But to take a step back is also to understand what is the capacity that exists for me to be able to report effectively enough, right? So as we move forward within the Paris Agreement, the one significant way in which it differs from the previous regime is, all countries now have to submit and report on their climate actions and their emissions inventories and what is really happening domestically when we talk about, climate change. But if I don't have the capacity as a country to be able to measure what is going on in my own nation, I can't actually report it. And if I am, a small, fairly economically backward country, yet I am actually managing to invest in a lot of solar, however, my politics or my government does not have the capacity to be able to transparently report what is happening, I again come back to the table looking like the nation that is not doing enough, even though I may be doing a lot, especially considering where my GDP stands today as a country. So we need to bring that trust back again through effectively talking about what the current baseline actually is in terms of what is happening. Where is it that I actually need support in trying to identify what is happening and measuring what is happening so that I can effectively report it to the global community? And once I identify, what are the gaps in that capacity itself, and also what are the sectors in which I could, use a little bit more international support, automatically it opens up the space, for international donors, for bilateral partners to then put money into spaces where countries actually need it today, and this kind of goes beyond these very large cohorts of mitigation finance or adaptation finance. This really sort of goes to a grassroots level eventually, in identifying the granularity of support that is required. On the other side, what it also does is it forces countries to therefore be able to look at where this money has, been going for the last few years, and how effective has it been in terms of being able to retain support. So this entire evaluation, actually, we've developed. My colleague Sumit Prasad has actually spearheaded this research, where he has developed something called the capacity building assessment matrix. And what it tries to do is, it's a tool that essentially would allow for a country to be able to assess, where is it that they've got international support to build capacity? Where is it that they have retained that capacity? What is an area that they have not even identified as, needing support in? And what are they actually doing really well at themselves, and it kind of opens up the conversation in a way that is so much more trustful and transparent. And it's something that, the global climate politicking system really requires today. So I think like bringing back trust will depend an awful lot on how much transparency we're able to put into the system again.
That's fair. So far, we've been talking about the Paris Agreement, and because it is sort of path breaking in international climate negotiations. But last year, India also signed something called the Kigali Amendment. Can you break down what the Kigali Amendment is and what exactly we've committed to?
Sure. So, many, many years ago, we had discovered that there was, a hole in the ozone layer, and we had identified the cause of that. And the world came together in the most successful environmental agreement, which is called the Montreal Protocol, to tackle this challenge. And the Montreal Protocol, I call it, and if you speak to most people of IR who have looked at environmental agreements, this is the most successful environmental treaty that the world has ever seen, because in its conceptualization as well as in its implementation, today, when we think about having solved for the ozone, we've come 90% of the way there. So it really is, a very interesting blueprint to also evaluate to see whether, we can pick up from there and put it into, the space of climate negotiations. But that's a separate conversation. So along the lines of the Montreal Protocol, what they discovered was that these ozone depleting substances that the Montreal Protocol agreed to phase out globally, the alternatives were actually really potent greenhouse gases. So what that means is that when we think about, greenhouse gases, and we always talk in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, at a molecular level, these gases are thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide. And when, this sort of discovery started becoming mainstream and, started getting pulled up into the Montreal Protocol, countries had to start thinking about, well, all right, how do we tackle it? Because it's a problem that came into being essentially while they were trying to solve for what the Montreal Protocol was set out to solve for. It is with that backstory that, after several years, almost like 7 to 14 years, I'm still not sure when the conversation actually began. But after many years of, international diplomacy and like negotiations, the Kigali Amendment came into force. So it was agreed upon, and India was part of, a grouping of over 190 countries. I think there were 197 in total, including India, that signed on to the Kigali Amendment. So what the Kigali Amendment essentially aims to do is follow what the Montreal Protocol did in terms of phasing out the production and consumption and therefore the emissions arising out of these sets of gases that are used as alternatives to ODS. So they're called HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. What was really interesting about the Kigali Amendment is for the first time, instead of having the two cohorts of developed and developing countries, we actually had three groupings that were created. So it was related to the developed countries, right? Then you had a track 2 of nations, which was largely your developing countries. But then we had a third entire set of nations that came together under the hot ambient temperature countries. And India actually led this grouping. So the way that this happened is, one scientist started discovering that these alternatives to the ODS, which is your HFCs, were causing a lot of harm and, could potentially pose a massive risk to global warming and the ambitions that were trying to get tackled within the UNFCCC. There was a lot of, new attention that was being put across all countries, right? Because the Montreal Protocol essentially took into account every single nation, largely. And developing countries, were being put under the spanner also as developed countries to come forward in committing to phasing down these new sets of gases that they had discovered as greenhouse gases. There was a number going around, a few years ago, about like 10, 12 years ago, which was based on a study that had been conducted primarily for developed countries, that suggested that all developing countries or emerging economies, 25% of their emissions profile would come from HFCs. Now, that's a huge number, right? So the minute you start thinking about, okay, if 25% of my emissions are coming from this particular gas, I have to clamp down on it, right? And it was with that reasoning, and that was the baseline with which negotiations started happening. And pressure started mounting up on developing countries to do something about it, so that we could finally come together with some sort of an amendment within the Montreal Protocol. So what we at CEW actually did was we did the math, we actually went out and did a bottom-up, evaluation of what this emissions profile would actually look like. And again, the assumptions for this didn't exist back then. The notion of these being greenhouse gases, in fact, was not even internalized, at a granular level in India, because this was just a conversation that was happening within the Montreal Protocol, right? And it was actually something that put CEW in a slightly strange, space, because here we were as a new think tank in India, the new kids on the block talking about what was primarily considered a Western agenda, It's only when we actually came out with the modeling numbers and, came out with an assessment that was primarily conducted through expert interviews, as well as, understanding both industry and policy priorities and market realities, and my colleague, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, actually led this entire effort, that we understood that India's emissions profile from HFCs, in a business as usual scenario, was only going to be about 5 to 7%. So when you think about a 25%, emissions profile versus a 5 to 7% emissions profile, the problem that you're trying to solve for is immediately a lot smaller. Having said that, we also understood that means that India's consumption was only going to grow further after 2050, right? So we had looked at the numbers up until 2050, and then we realized that, well, if it's still so small, it means that whatever we've learned from industry and government in terms of the market reality of how this gas gets consumed is going to increase after that, because this is the gas that is currently, essentially used in all sorts of ACs and refrigeration products, as well as units. So with that information, it actually allowed India to be able to negotiate for a much longer timeline, saying that, look, if it is just 5 to 7%, we need more time to be able to find technology alternatives that work for our temperature conditions. Because the alternatives that do exist even now, except if we're talking about natural refrigerants, are still patented, are very expensive to access. And more importantly, we're not really sure of how effectively they work in, the kind of hot temperatures that India has, The second part of that reality is that cooling is, if we look at the numbers, it is still a luxury in India. However, it is also a necessity, for our health, for our well-being, for our productivity. So as the country grows economically, one can assume that the access to cooling is going to increase, and it should increase. And the technologies therefore need to start readying themselves to becoming more and more sustainable in terms of providing that cooling access that is affordable, but also very importantly, also very sustainable. So it was with that sort of reasoning, right, and armed with this new information of what our emissions profile could look like, that India actually negotiated very hard and qualified, itself and a group of countries to fall under a third bracket, where the date from where we start phasing down our production and consumption or market placement of these high global warming potential gases, we have a longer timeline before we start phasing it down. We catch up with the rest of the world fairly quickly, after that. So even though we're starting late, we have aggressive policy, aggressive targets in the interim to still meet the world at the end of the century in being at a place where we have effectively contributed to scaling back almost all of these gases use and the emissions coming out of them. So that's really India's leadership that got marked, within the Kigali Amendment and led to the success and global acceptance of what the Kigali Amendment intended to do.
No, I think that's pretty amazing, because whenever we think about sort of India on the global stage, there's a lot of talk, at least in the foreign policy arena, of how India acts sort of as a moral power and always expects sort of exceptionalism for itself. But I think this is also sort of where our foreign policy does pay off in acknowledging that we are a developing country and we have these challenges to meet. And these are not sort of concerns that are unique to us. There are a lot of developing countries around the world that also shared the same concerns as India in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also where the differentiation and how we emerge, or how different countries are, sort of moving into the emerging economy versus the least developed economies. So it's also that politics is like consistently changing, right? And that's also why we need to be more innovative in our own foreign policy, to think to, well, who is likely to be my next partner, in this particular battle that the world is trying to solve for. And I think, from that perspective, the Kigali Amendment has offered a completely different platform, in terms of who India has come together with as part of this third cohort of countries.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about sort of the Kigali Amendment and cooling in that sense, you were sort of the co-author for the India Cooling Action Plan, right? Can you walk us through the plan and what this means?
Sure. So while the Kigali Amendment largely looks at the set of gases, right, and it's really about phasing down HFCs, that's only one part of the cooling story. And India domestically has shown great leadership. I mean, we're the first country to have come out with an India Cooling Action Plan. So not only are we the first ones to have come out with it, we were also the first one to have conceptualized it as an idea, right? That meeting your Kigali Amendment commitments and looking at appliances that use these gases is only one part of the cooling story, because, less than 8% of the houses in India today, or less than 8% of the population in India today, has access to an air conditioner, right? And if you look at the kind of temperatures we live in, we know that yes, that number will increase, as people are able to afford these products, as energy supplies become more secure. But the other part of it is that people are still looking to fans and coolers, as much as possible to keep up, and maintain their own resilience when it, against the heat stress that our country has. Mm. So when we think about it from that point of view, and we look at the amount of heat stress, that so many millions of people in India suffer against, these ACs are only a very small part of that problem then. And the India Cooling Action Plan is essentially a blueprint and a great policy wish list of what all we really need to think about as we think about providing sustainable, efficient, and affordable, thermal comfort to our population. So that's one overarching premise, of what the Cooling Action Plan actually seeks to do. A second aspect that the Cooling Action Plan tries to bring forward is what are the sectors in which cooling is going to grow, right? So one aspect is, of course, like household comfort, human comfort. The other aspect very quickly becomes, well, what about cold chain, right? And this is again something that the pandemic has shed light on. That how are we solving for vaccines? How are we solving for agricultural produce? We have ambitions, that suggest a doubling of farmers' income. How are we going to get there unless we're able to effectively, forego any kind of food losses and maximize, the return towards a farmer themselves? And cold chain and the development of an entire cold chain supply chain, which basically takes the produce from farm to your plate at home. How do we effectively galvanize that? So the India Cooling Action Plan looks to all of these subsectors. I mean, this is one example, but essentially the India Cooling Action Plan is looking to human comfort, but is also looking to providing a fillip to all of these other sectors that will need it and that are related very much to cooling as part of India's development story.
When we're talking about the India Cooling Action Plan, as someone who's been very interested in public policy and public policy processes, I've always wondered how policies, particularly climate policies, have gone through, from the time that they've been written all the way to implementation. So can you sort of use the India Cooling Action Plan as a case to tell us about how the government makes climate policy?
Sure, and thank you for this question because for those of us who've been involved and in the India Cooling Action Plan, we've actually walked away extremely inspired with the way that it got developed, and created into what it is today. The National Ozone Unit of India, which is essentially the agency that responds to the Kigali Amendment or the Montreal Protocol to begin with. This is called the ozone cell. It's housed within the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. And they have brought together in an effort of creating the India Cooling Action Plan, not just civil society and research stakeholders such as CEW and others, but also industry associations and every single government agency and independent agency that is related to how the cooling story will develop in India. And by doing that, they've created this multi-stakeholder process where everybody gets to contribute actively, has their concerns and challenges tabled, and highlights solutions, most importantly, of how we really need to think about developing, the entire India Cooling Action Plan. And so then if you look through the chapters and what the India Cooling Action Plan actually includes, not only is it talking about, the industry perspective of technology viabilities, and how R&D should focus on pilots. It's also looking at assessing a baseline of which way the markets are going to go. It's also capitalizing on every single government, scheme and priority across all of these relevant ministries that exist with the perspective of being able to give it a fillip. So at the end of it, what it's doing is not reinventing a wheel, but really identifying cooling as, being critical to India's development story and internalizing that in projects and schemes and, government priorities that already exist and have been tabled today. Bringing together all of these stakeholders also opened up the conversation, and created a sense of ownership towards what it means to provide sustainable cooling for all. And I think that's plain to see because if you just do a very quick search on the kind of, basic panel discussions that organizations have hosted, that work on sustainable cooling, Today, you'll find industry representation, you'll find civil society representation, you'll find, of course, the ozone cell and the Ministry of Environment supporting that. But you will also find, the Ministry of Power, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, ESL, which is all of these have become active participants to the conversation itself, and in that is what becomes really inspiring then for us to assume that the goals that are there within the India Cooling Action Plan have a much higher chance of getting implemented and met, just because the conversation is still going forward with everybody who's going to have to be a part of the solution.
That sounds really amazing, because we know that having sort of diverse, inclusive approaches into decision making lead to better outcomes, right? And whenever I thought of policy being made in India, I generally just assumed a bunch of old Savarna dudes sitting around a table. But I think this gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, us too, actually.
Okay, Shikha, this is sort of my last question for you.
Sure.
But for anyone who is interested in reading more about climate change, or particularly India's climate policy, what books or resources would you recommend?
So I think one of the first place that I would start looking, if I really wanted to get a sense of India's climate policy, would be the submissions that, have been made by our government to the UNFCCC. Because that's really at the heart of the conversation. This is what India is putting out globally. This is what India wants you to know its international climate policy actually is. So I would start by looking there. And the second resource that I would suggest, to everybody, and this also has some really interesting chapters that have been written out by my colleagues, looking at the Kigali Amendment as well. This is a book called India in a Warming World, Integrating Climate Change and Development, and it's been edited by Navroz Ki Dubash. But this actually has, chapters from every single person who is truly an authority on anything related to India's climate policy and India's cooling policy, because it reflects not just on the leadership or, the political nuances of what's happening within the climate change convention, but also what's happening in the Montreal Protocol, also what we've done when it comes to aviation emissions, what are we really thinking about when it comes to climate risks, so on and so forth. So it's a book that actually captures, multiple facets and sectors that really are at the heart of a climate policy for any country.
Okay, that sounds really good. I will link to these in the episode show notes. Shikha, thank you so much for coming on to us and elucidating India's climate policy so clearly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting for me as well. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us till the end. Shikha's recommendations are in the episode bio, so I do recommend checking those out. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to me at HamsiniH on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. States of Anarchy would not be possible without the help of the kind folks at the Takshashila Institution and the independent Public Spirited Media Foundation. And finally, thank you for listening in every week and for being kind and considerate with your feedback and reviews. If you want to help us reach more people, please leave us a rating on iTunes or your podcast app. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app and website, but on Spotify, iTunes, Ghana, Google Podcasts, or whatever you're using right now. We'll be back on November 9th. Till then, stay safe and stay healthy.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset and everything sport.
So tune in to the Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Nankali podcast every Wednesday. सिर्फ IVM podcast ऐप या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.